Well, I'd like to welcome you to this coffee house of the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly. Tonight we're really pleased to launch the first of a three-part monthly series of educational discussions that the Workers' Assembly is organizing on the theme of anti-capitalism and feminism. And through the course of today we'll be, informing you about all the other things that we're doing and the various events. And there's also a little sign-up sheet that is at the back. Okay, that if anyone wants to be put on our email list. So I'm Abby Backen. I'm the head of the Department of Gender Studies at Queen's University. I teach at Queen's University in Kingston. I'm also a member of the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly. The Workers' Assembly has been around for about 3.5 years, and we have a committee structure. And one of the committees is the Internal Education Committee, and that is the committee that's organizing this series of events. So I'm here with some of my colleagues, sisters, and brothers and comrades. Heather Walker, just put your hand up, is the co-organizer for tonight's event. And we're very pleased to have two very busy, very prestigious speakers who I will introduce in a minute. Tonight's presentation is simply called Anti-Capitalism and Feminism, and the two presentations are given by Meg Luxton, who'll start. She'll have some PowerPoint and some discussion on socialist feminism in Canada, a brief history, followed by Shahrzad Mojab, speaking on Marxist feminism, keywords and key concepts. So let me just say a little bit about each of these speakers, and then, the main event is I'll pass it over to hear them. Meg is a very long time and present activist in the women's liberation movement and a path-breaking scholar in advancing socialist feminist theory in Canada and really internationally. Canada is known for exporting many things, and one of them is ideas about socialist feminism. Meg has been active in the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, various campus and community groups, and she's the professor and director of the graduate program in Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies at York University. She writes on feminist politics, women's work, both paid and unpaid, and is involved in the international effort to include women's unpaid work in the United Nations, and also on the history of the Canadian women's movement, particularly its left-wing currents. So let's give a round of applause to our speaker in advance.
So these are hard times for those of us who are anti-capitalist, who loathe the inevitable exploitation, competition, and rewards for selfishness and greed that characterize the essential nature of capitalism. The capitalist class and its right-wing allies have done, or its right-wing advocates, sorry, have done a great job of smashing their opponents in the current period. And I'm talking here, I'm not talking about the whole world, just here. One of their greatest victories has been the way they've made alternative visions and the movements supporting anti-capitalism seem impossible. They have, with the help of many of the regimes of 20th century communist governments, even stolen our language. So we talk of anti-capitalism because communism and socialism have been robbed of their positive meanings. So I want to thank Abby and Heather and everybody else who's been involved in organizing this event, because it's quite important and special for us to have a chance to come together and explore these ideas and talk to each other about them. I want to talk about a little bit, Abby asked me to talk about the history of socialist feminism in Canada, which I think goes back in Canada at least 100 years, so I'm not going to do that. And it emerged in Europe in the 1920s, so it's coming up for its 200th anniversary, and I think we should have a birthday party. But I am going to focus on the period from the 1960s to the 1980s, because I think the political struggles of that period were important and have been significantly misrepresented, even within feminism, or particularly within feminism. I want to argue that the right-wing mobilizations of the last 40 years and the politics of neoliberalism that we are living under now are part of a systematic effort by right-wing pro-capitalist advocates to destroy the political vision formulated by the left-wing anti-capitalist activists of the 1960s in the women's liberation movement. So I have a question. How many of you know or have heard that the American women's liberation activists burned their bras? Anybody heard this expression? I don't want to know what you really know about it. I just want to know if you've heard about it. Okay. So in August 1968, in the United States, a group of young women protested against the Miss America beauty contest by crowning a sheep and depositing girdles, curlers, and issues of Ladies' Home Journal and Playboy magazine into a trash can. They were protesting the manufactured and commercialized ideals of female beauty embodied in the Miss America beauty contest. They didn't actually burn anything, but the New York Post used the phrase in its report, and it became one of those historical truths for a really long time. Feminists burn their bras. They got enormous publicity, and their reputed bra burning went down in history. How many of you know that on Mother's Day 1968, the same year, American women's liberation activists helped to organize the Poor People's March, in which about 5,000 working class and poor women, Black, white, and Chicana, marched on Washington protesting attacks on welfare recipients, the lack of childcare and jobs, and they chanted slogans, Mother Power, Income, Dignity, Justice, and Democracy. Anybody heard about this? Oh, goody, there's 3 of you. They got much less publicity, and their demonstration is not an established part of US women's liberation history. You don't find it in the history of the women's movement. You may not be surprised to know that finding information and pictures about the women's liberation movement in Canada and Quebec in the 1960s is even harder. And its socialist feminist current is even harder to find. Socialist feminism, and I'm talking about English language, rest of Canada based, if you know what I mean by that, outside of Quebec, politics of the 60s to the 80s. I'm not really talking about anything else, although maybe in discussion we can talk about how it was tied to other movements. But that's my subject. And socialist feminists advanced at least 3 main principles. And principles I'm going to argue that I think are worth revisiting now and maybe taking up. 1, that the liberation of women depends on the liberation of everyone. That as long as even one person is oppressed or exploited, we are all at risk. 2, that the overthrow of ruling elites and existing structures requires mass mobilizations, coalitions, and a politics of solidarity that aspire to a genuine democracy. Something we can't even imagine at this point, but we have to work toward. And 3, that the way we deal with and relate to each other, the way we do politics now, the way we live our lives in the here and now, will inevitably shape the future we create. So we can't wait till after the revolution. Rather, we have a responsibility to try to live our politics, however hard that may be. So in this talk, I want to explore 3 issues. The first has to do with how we know what we know and the importance of history. Like many people who lived through the 1960s, I'm alarmed by how much prevailing interpretations contradict my sense of what happened. This disjuncture between memory and interpretation is not just an inevitable consequence of time passing. You know, people's memories change. I will grant you that. But it has arisen because, as the hopeful radical promise of the 1960s and early 70s faded, it's being dismissed as ridiculous, sinister, and possibly utopian, and it's been alternatively reviled and in many cases romanticized. 60s radicalism has become retrospectively incomprehensible because its framework of assumptions has been so thoroughly defeated. The second theme I want to explore involves revisiting the politics of the women's liberation movement, a left-wing current of the women's movement and a feminist current of the left. The socialist feminist politics that developed in Canada in the 1960s, while part of a larger international women's liberation movement, also reflected the unique politics of Canada and generated a sophisticated politics and theory that have largely been defeated in the present period, but which I argue warrant revisiting and revitalizing. The third is the challenge posed by the politics of women's liberation for the current period, particularly as they relate to what feminist political economy now calls social reproduction, which is what most people refer to as managing the competing demands of paid employment and the rest of your life. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s insisted that capitalism depends on women's unpaid caregiving labor, and that any anti-capitalist politics must make that issue central if it is to succeed. And I would suggest that one small reason for the failure of the left to build its politics is its failure to really take that up seriously. I want to tell you one moment in my own personal experience about that particular politics. A bunch of us had tried to set up daycare at U of T. U of T said universities was not a place for daycare, so we occupied a building, set up an under-twos daycare center. Then the kids turned 2 and they said you can't have under-twos and over-twos in the same place because they might kill each other. These are the same people who advocate nuclear families. Doesn't make sense, but never mind. So we occupied another building, and that occupation actually lasted about 8 months. There were about 150 adults, and I don't remember how many kids, living together 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for that period. And I remember an evening when it had been my turn with somebody else to make dinner for everybody, and we would put the food out, and we were about to go upstairs to call people to come and eat. Excuse me. And I suddenly had a flash of what we were doing. We had collectivized our personal lives. We were raising our kids collectively. We were living collectively. And we were having a blast. Yes. And at the same time, we were learning all kinds of things because we studied, we were reading Freud to try to figure out what we thought about raising kids, sexuality, we were reading Marx. And it was a living educational moment that was actually, for those of us involved, quite life-transforming. And it seems to me that experience, and I can hear some of my friends saying, what do you think about experience? We'll go, that's another question. That kind of political practice actually gave us something really concrete. We built a daycare center. It's still running. It's not producing the socialist babies we hoped for, but it has provided good childcare for about 5 generations of kids. And so there was in that period the opportunity for people to actually create things collectively that did reflect the kind of vision we had and that actually made tiny changes in our lives. You know, for very few people, but okay. So I want to just briefly remind you of the context of that time. In the early 1960s, most women in Canada, regardless of class, national origin, race, or ethnicity, whether they were rural or urban, were expected to follow a narrowly defined and pretty constrained life course. On leaving school, they had paid employment until they married men, and they married young. They were expected to be sexually active only within marriage. Once married, they were expected to have children, and they were responsible primarily for managing their households, caring for their children, any dependent adults, and their husbands. If necessary, they also did income-generating work. Their lives were strictly defined by their status as wives and mothers and their dependence on men. Few women could support themselves, even fewer could support themselves and their children. Women who didn't or couldn't conform to this pattern were subjected to social disapproval and had a pretty hard time getting by, usually. In the general left-wing radicalization that swept many countries in the 1960s, there was a widespread radicalization of women as socialists and also as women. It emerged in the mid-1960s and remained a vital political movement probably until about the 1980s. Inspired by the anti-imperialist struggles in places like Algeria and Vietnam, by the mobilizations of indigenous people over land claims and self-determination, by the civil rights movement in the US and anti-racist activism in Canada and Quebec, by the anti-poverty movements in many countries, and it was strong in Canada in the early 1970s. Many young women in the 1960s were also mobilized by at least 3 other forces. They confronted the dilemma of women in an age of reform, pulled between the rules of their upbringing and the need to change those rules. They were appalled by how constrained most of their mothers' lives were and aspired to something more. an aspiration made possible by the expanding education system and the growing labor market for women. They also dreamed of a cooperative, classless society, but what that more might look like was hard to imagine. They were outraged by the blatant sexism and hostility they faced, especially from their left-wing comrades. The opposition to women's liberation was fierce from the start, not only from politicians and the media, but from left men. Typically, it ignored the issues activists were raising and used ridicule and sexualization to humiliate and depoliticize the women. And I just realized I forgot to ask at the outset if there's anybody who needs me to read the text on the slides. If you do, okay. They struggled to find new ways of being women, rejecting the way Marxist versions of socialism had obliterated subjectivity, drawing on the work of cultural domination of anti-imperialists and black power thinkers such as Frantz Fanon, Eldridge Cleaver, Stokely Carmichael. But there were few guides to help women figure out what new forms of identity and subjectivity for activist women might look like. Many women aspired to be strong, independent, and self-actualizing while struggling with insecurities, fear, and a need to rely on others, especially men. For many, the rage they experienced about sexism complicated their sexual and emotional attractions and attachments to men. For others, homophobia crippled their ties to other women. Only later, as the writings of earlier women activists were republished, could young women of the 60s learn that earlier generations of women had faced similar struggles. The lives of Alexandra Kollontai, Anessa Armand, Rosa Luxemburg, Emma Goldman, Simone de Beauvoir, for example, revealed the history of personal anguish and pain that most socialist and activist women have experienced. The fact that their lives were largely unknown made it seem as if there was a conspiracy to conceal daily life and women, a conspiracy I would like to suggest that is in play at the moment. What made the experience of this new generation of activist women different and more bearable was a sense of sisterhood. And sisterhood's become a very problematic term in lots of ways, but it also had a very positive aspect, which is this sense of solidarity among women. The shared camaraderie of being in collectives and being part of a women's movement and of trying to make something new. As a movement, women's liberation had close ties to the socialist, communist, and other left-wing progressive political movements of the time. It also shared most of the concerns of the older women's movement based in the labor movement and the unions, and in women's rights organizations and services, many of which had their origins in the 19th century. Drawing on both, it began with the critique of the inadequacies in existing politics, challenging the male-dominated left to deal with its profound sexism and its authoritarian traditions, and disrupting the reformist orientations of the larger women's movement, and making ourselves unpopular as we did that. I remember at the Strategy for Change conference in 1972, every time the Trotskyists stood up to speak, Moira Armour pulled the plug out of the microphones. But many of the individuals who came to left-wing women's liberation knew little or nothing of those other movements, and at least at first had no idea that what they were doing was part of a larger movement or a movement that had hundreds of years of history behind it. They came together in small, locally based groups, and at least initially had the sense that they were inventing their politics autonomously and for the first time in history. For example, New Left activists in Canada, recognizing that the majority of women were housewives, tried to understand the position of women using Marxist analysis of capital. We were exhilarated by the new theoretical advances of the domestic labor debate and excited by the politics of mobilizing housewives. It was only later, as feminist social historians explored earlier movements, that we learned about the same debates occurring in Britain and Europe in the 1840s, and realized we'd been forced to reinvent the wheel because the history of earlier social movements had been suppressed and unavailable to us. And literally some of the debates we had happened in the 1840s, and some of the same controversies. We didn't get a chance to learn from them. We started from scratch, and it was too bad. The 1960s and 70s were full of grassroots organizing efforts and mass mobilizations, although when I say mass mobilizations, you have to understand this is Toronto, mass mobilization is, 200 people, 300 people. But never mind. This new women's movement rejected all limits to the equality of women's rights and showed that equality in daily life cannot be obtained through simple legal, political, or institutional reforms. They developed scathing critiques of what was called the system, meaning the whole of existing society. The essential exploitation inherent in capitalist industrial military complex, all institutions, cultural practices, and normative values. They were clear that the whole organization of society had to be changed, from the large capitalist economic structures to the intimacies of interpersonal interactions. They struggled to find a theoretical language to contest the power of prevailing assumptions and to reveal the minutiae of subordination. They dreamed of a different world without hierarchies and inequalities. They insisted that until all of us are free, none of us are free. In opposition, they strove to create alternatives, egalitarian personal relationships, democratic participatory collectives, not-for-profit worker-user-controlled groups that they hoped would prefigure the egalitarian socialist society of the future they hoped to build. So across the country, women began forming groups, doing consciousness raising, holding study groups, publishing to educate themselves and others, turning to direct action, providing abortion services, health centers, militant theater, daycare, shelters for battered women, and rape crisis centers, and organizing for equal pay and equal access to jobs, struggling within unions for recognition of women's issues, even setting up women's studies programs. It's no coincidence that 3 of us here are professors of women's studies. Captured by the slogan, "No socialism without women's liberation, no women's liberation without socialism," a strong socialist feminist current was central to the women's movement of Canada and Quebec. In this period, socialist feminist women's liberation politics were full of hope and possibilities. Working collectively, we could see our victories, and we lived with changes we had made happen. For a brief moment, radical activists envisioned a future free from oppression and exploitation, and articulated demands that challenged gender, race, and class hierarchies, and imagined an economy based on cooperation, not competition. From the late 1970s, the right and supporters of capitalist class interests were to mobilize neoliberal politics in earnest to extract revenge for that moment of freedom. That's Rita McNeil. Okay. One of the key areas of struggle for women's liberation focused on ways to end women's forced dependence on men by ensuring women's capacity to live autonomously or in egalitarian ways with men. This involved a complex set of issues, changing sexual mores, control over reproduction, access to the means of economic independence. It involved new ways of ensuring that caregiving for children and dependent adults is provided well without penalizing people who withdraw from the labor force to provide it. It also meant struggling with men's violence against women, with gender identities and relations. Fundamentally, it also challenged existing family forms. There was an argument that the heterosexual nuclear family form that was dominant is intrinsically oppressive to women and children as well as to men, that it is antisocial and fosters individualism and competition. In opposition, women's liberation insisted that no one family form should be privileged, that the state had no business regulating personal relationships, that children should be cared for collectively, as should anyone who needed care. Marxist feminists argued that struggles around such issues were central to any efforts to challenge the hegemony of capitalism. They faced considerable resistance, not only from those supporting capitalism, but from men and some women on the left. In many places, socialist feminists were told that raising women's issues was divisive and weakened anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist struggles. Wait till after the revolution and we'll deal with that, we were told. In practice, most activist initiatives focused on organizing employed workers' struggles against capitalist employers. on military efforts to seize state power, or on building social democratic parties able to contest elections, all of which are important. But issues directly relating to the daily lives of most working class, poor, and even middle class women were ignored, and the deep sexism of many activists on the left and their organizations were vigorously denied. I want to end with this issue because I think it lies at the heart of the struggles we're living through today. For the capitalist economy to function, employers rely on their workers showing up every day, ready and relatively willing to work. This requires workers who are appropriately socialized, educated, and healthy enough in order to be willing and able to work. It also requires new generations of workers able to replace those who retire and die. Socialist feminists have shown that social reproduction, the processes necessary to enable workers to show up on the job, involves socially necessary labor, most of which is performed as unpaid domestic labor, typically by women, although increasingly by some men. This analysis understands wages as the costs of social reproduction of labor, and means that the supply and demand for labor are linked to social structures, relations and processes involved in family formation, care work, education, health, and other arenas of social reproduction. The very concept of social reproduction reminds us that people do not live as neoliberal individuals or individual families. They live instead in relation to other people. They have babies, raise children, and look after those who cannot care for themselves. They migrate to obtain better living standards for their families, sometimes having to leave their families behind. The labor market and capitalism cannot exist without these processes, and in fact, these processes constitute them. From this perspective, states have an obligation to address the systemic discrimination that produces inequality, something that the current Tory government doesn't quite seem to get yet. Responding to both the demands of the women's movement to address these inequalities and to the need for more women in the labor force, some welfare states throughout the 20th century did introduce a range of social policies. Maternity leave, childcare, pay equity, things like that. But the right-wing mobilization of the last 40 years has been a deliberate effort to undermine even the modest redistribution of the welfare state. Neoliberalism's commitments to reducing state expenditures and supporting private enterprise depend on the majority of people accepting the claim that individuals freely make choices and take up responsibility for themselves, and that it's up to individual families to provide for their members and not for the society as a whole. This view reveals the ways in which inherited wealth and class, racialized and gendered privilege, act as an affirmative action program for the well-to-do. Some individuals may be able to live out the neoliberal idea. The majority of the world cannot. Neoliberalism is a project designed to secure the position of capitalist elites. It depends on the exploitation of a global working class population and has a deeply vested interest in containing any efforts on the part of working class people to reduce inequalities. The success depends on persuading or forcing individuals to bear responsibility for social reproduction, which means women, people of color, and working people generally. Central to that effort is a commitment to deny the existence of social classes, of systemic racist exploitation, and of the necessity of women's contribution to social reproduction. Neoliberalism must demonize as vehemently as possible the ideals and promises of feminist, anti-racist socialism. And as we see repeatedly from the G20 and the Occupy, to Idle No More, to Teresa Spence's actions, neoliberals organize to restrain and prevent progressive mobilizations. It's committed to repressing the history of alternative political movements and to exterminating our visions of how societies might be organized. I suggest the socialist political vision and goals of the 1960s and 70s women's liberation movement offer an oppositional perspective we might find useful to think about today.